Hey everyone, Alec here from Shape Gaming. Are you stuck using Blizzard's UI because you thought that Elvui is too complicated to figure out? I'm here to tell you that there's no reason for you to be stuck with Blizzard's boring interface when you can learn how to build your own UI from scratch. If you follow me through this video, I'll show you the basics that you need to set up your own user interface using Elvui so that you're ready for Dragonflight launch. Let's get started. Unlike many of the other WoW add-ons, Elvui isn't installed and managed through CurseForge. Instead, you have to manually install and update the add-on. Start by opening up your search engine of choice, which we all know should be Chrome. Type in Elvui and hit enter. The main website is called Tuki. Find Elvui and click download, which will drop a zip file to your download file. This will normally show up along the bottom of your screen. Once it's done downloading, you're going to click on the folder to unzip it. While this is running, open up another file explorer. This will make it easier to drag and drop the files into the correct location. You're going to now find your WoW folder, which is typically in your Programs folder, Programs 86, and World of Warcraft. From here, select the client you're playing with. In our case, we're playing retail in preparation for Dragonflight. Go to Interface and then Add-ons. From here, you're going to go back to the folder with the Elvui folders in it and drag and drop them into the Add-ons folder. It's important to understand this process because it's something that you'll do quite frequently, since you'll have to follow these steps every time the add-on versioning is out of date. You'll notice that I've already installed Elvui, so I'm going to go with the Replace File Destination option, whereas if you're downloading this for the first time, the add-on will simply copy over. We're going to start with a brand new account so that we can start from scratch. The first option in the initial install window is CVARs. We're simply going to click Setup CVARs and continue. For Setup Chat, again, we're going to click Setup Chat to remove the Blizzard UI and hit continue. Within profile settings, we want to click a new profile so that we can build this from scratch. Within theme setup, this is completely up to your preference. You have three options, Classic, Dark, and Class. And you'll notice as you click through them, they basically just change some of the coloring of the background of the various panels on your screen. So you can see Classic gives you a lighter look. When you click on Dark, you'll see all the panels go to a little darker black or gray. And then finally you'll have Class, which will inherit the class color that Blizzard has for each class that you play. So for my case, I have a Paladin here, so I'm going to get the Paladin pink. I personally like the class color the most because it just adds a little nice look and feel. So I'm going to go with Class, but select whichever option you prefer. Hit continue, and then we move into the UI scale. Again, this is completely a preference option. I normally will use auto scale, or I'll use something between 0.5 and 0.6, or just select the small option if being lazy. For reference, I'm running a 1440p 27-inch monitor, so I'm going to go through the options here to give you just a look at what this does to the scaling. So starting with small, and then when you move into medium, you'll notice all the buttons get larger, start to get a little too large for my taste at this point. And then you can move into large, which I find takes up way too much of your screen. And then again, you have auto scale. So I'm going to go small this time around, but pick whichever option you prefer and then click continue. Within layout, if I'm being honest, there's not too much of a difference that I see outside of Elvui will kind of move your bars around a little bit between the melee, healer, and ranged options. Honestly, we're going to move the action bars around anyway, so you can pick any of them. I'm going to pick healer just because that's a class I typically play, and then hit continue. This will move us into the aura bars and icons only option. I always just click aura bars so that Elvui sets up the overlay for auras and icons, and then hit continue. And then you will see your last box here that says clicked finished, and you've now successfully run through the install process, and you are awesome. And there was much celebration. All right, so you'll notice once you've gotten through that process, it is going to disappear. So Elvui is no longer on your screen. So let's go through a few steps that you can use to get the configuration panel back open. So the first option you have is just to hit escape, and then you'll see Elvui is actually one of the options that you see under add-ons. So you can click that and it'll bring up the panel. Your other option is to click enter and then type in /Elvui. Again, that will bring up the panel for you. And then your final option, which is the one I prefer because it's the shortest, is clicking enter and then typing /EC, which will also bring up that configuration panel. So we know how to open up the panel so that we can get to it at any time. So let's go into what we're going to look at today. So for the sake of today's tutorial, we're really just going to look at the basics of what we see here on the screen so that you can have a nice clean UI for Dragonflight launch. So the options we're going to focus on today are the general, your action bars, your buffs and debuffs, your maps, and then we'll do just a little looking at how to toggle and move around all your UI anchors. As we move into this, 2 tips or tricks that you can keep in mind as you're working through the options after this video are, first off, I find that the defaults for this add-on are pretty good. So if you're uncomfortable kind of deep diving into any specific section of the interface configuration, I would just suggest leaving it as default until you're feeling better with it and then you can mess around. Second, if you're ever unsure of what any of the elements of the UI are referencing, I always suggest clicking this toggle anchors button towards the bottom of the panel here. And what this will do is it will hide this box we're looking at and show you all of the different UI modules or anchors on your screen. So it's a nice way to figure out which of the anchors you're messing around with when you're clicking different options. So you can toggle back and forth between the toggle anchors option. All right, so starting with general, let's dig into this tab here. There are only 2 sections that I pay attention to within this tab. The first is the UI scale, which shows the same options that we saw during the initial install process. So if you ever needed to swap your UI because you accidentally picked the large one and you feel like it's too large, or you picked the small one and you want to make it a little bigger, you can use this section of the general tab and that will allow you to modify that again. The only other section here that I look at is the automation. So within the automation, you will see an option to announce interrupts. It will allow you to announce them in various channels in a say, yell, guild, party, so on and so forth, just depending on your preference. I don't typically use this because I just see it, it's just too much bloat for me and I don't care to see it on my screen. Next to that, you'll see an option that says accept invites, which will automatically accept invites from a friend or from your guild. I have friends that personally really like this feature. However, it also allows us to invite them to anything and the game automatically accepts the invite. So sometimes they've found that they have to turn that off because we'll mess with them and just keep inviting them to things while they're, trying to quest or complete other parts of the game. The last feature worth noting is the auto repair, which allows you to select to auto repair from your guild manually if you select none and using your personal gold. What this will do is if you toggle it on, anytime you open a vendor that can repair, it will automatically inherit one of those 3 options. All right, back across the top, we're going to look over the media table, which has a much bigger impact on your UI's kind of look and feel. So we're going to focus on fonts here. This section will allow you to modify the font settings within this UI window and also to all the other elements of your UI if you would like it to. There are also default replacements to many of the Blizzard UI nameplates, which I just leave as defaulted. The default font, the font size, and the font outline will apply to all of the elements within this UI configuration panel that we're viewing currently. If you want it to apply to everything that we see on the screen, even the elements outside of the configuration panel, you can also select apply font to all and it will carry over these settings to any fonts on the various elements in your screen. For instance, you'll notice if I hit apply all, it will change the chat panels. So you'll notice that my loot and my general and my combat log all change. So go ahead and pick a font and size that you like. I would personally suggest keeping your font size between 12 and 16 so that you don't have any text overlap or squishing on your panels. You'll notice that if I increase this up until the 30s or 40s, the text becomes way too large and overlaps and you can't see what's going on anymore. So you'll want to try to monitor and manage the size of your font to minimize this issue. So click apply font to all once you've selected your font and your size, and now you've successfully updated your UI's font. From here, we're going to move into the cosmetic tab across the top. This is another section where I keep most of the add-on default as is. However, there are 2 sections that I like to modify. There's a bottom panel and a top panel here. These are normally areas where you can house different icons. I personally don't care for these, so I hide them. You'll notice that you have options to make them wider or make them taller or shorter. Again, if you want to use these, you can, but I always turn them off. The other option you have is the AFK mode. This has no real impact on your UI. It just displays an AFK screen with your character on it once you've hit your AFK timeout. I find this is sometimes nice if you stream and you happen to have an AFK. It brings something maybe a little nicer for your audience to look at outside of your empty chair. Those are really the only 2 options that I mess with in the cosmetic tab. So the next tab over you'll see is alternative power. We're going to leave the alternative power tab enabled with the defaults and then move over to the Blizzard UI improvements tab. Within the Blizz UI improvements tab, there are a few interesting options that are worth looking at. The first one is the quests. Within the quest section, you'll see an option to mark quest reward and XP quest percent. Mark quest reward will put a gold coin icon next to the gear that is worth the most at the vendor when you're turning in a quest. This is helpful when all the vendor rewards aren't useful to your character and you just want to pick really quickly the thing that's worth the most. The XP quest percent will simply show how much of a percentage the quest is worth relative to your level. The next section is the item level. There are 2 nice to have features here. The display character info info shows the eye level of the gear that you have on or pick up. So when you hit your C keybind to look at your character, it will display those item levels next to each piece of gear and your overall item level. And the display inspect info option allows you to see the same kind of options, but on other characters or players that you inspect. So I like to toggle both of those on. The last section here is the objective frame. Within this section, you can determine different criteria when you might want to hide the objective frame that houses all of your quests. The one that typically shows all the way on the right side of your screen underneath your minimap. The auto hide option will hide the frame whenever you're in an arena or fighting a boss, and the hiding keystone will hide the frame anytime you're in a Mythic Plus dungeon. I personally keep both of these toggled on because I run a lot of dungeons and raids in Mythic Plus dungeons. Moving down to our action bars, this is probably where we're going to spend the most amount of time, both here in the tutorial and when you're actually modifying these on your own UI. So you'll notice the first tab that you have here is a general. This again has options that will impact all of the bars that follow it. So if I mess with any of the options here, it's going to carry those settings over to your player bars, your pet bar, your stance bar, your micro bar, and your extra button. I don't typically mess with any of these. I leave the defaults. So the key down, lock action bars, and action button glow, and then all of the other options as well. I don't mess with any of the casting options here because I use a separate add-on for all of my healing. So for all of my mouse over macros. So if you were to use the action bars for your mouse over macros, you could mess around with this. So we're going to move over to the action bars and look at one of these tabs. So the good thing about action bars is that most of these settings that you will mess around with within the player bars are the same options that you'll see within the pet bar, stance bar, micro bar, and extra button. So looking at this first option that we have here, again, I just keep the defaults. I keep the size ratio turned on, and then I keep the show empty buttons turned on. Within the button settings, you can modify how many buttons you want to see at a time. So you can have only one button all the way up to 12. I would suggest that you always are showing 12, unless you have a reason why you only want one button showing and you want to waste 11 other possible buttons that you could put on that bar. The second option, you have buttons per row. So if you do one button per row, it's going to make your bar vertical. If you do 12 buttons per row, it's going to make your bar horizontal. And then anywhere in between is going to start stacking your buttons. So I personally like to do 12 buttons and then 3 buttons per row. The reason why I do that is because I have a mouse that has buttons on the side of it that I can use for keybinds. So I'm able to match up these buttons with the buttons that are on the side of my mouse, which happens to be a 3x4 row. And it's just a nice way to kind of build that muscle memory. The next option you have is button spacing. So this just allows you to determine how much space you want between each of your buttons. I normally keep a 0 or a 1 or 2, somewhere right around there, just so that you're not getting a lot of space between them. So I'm going to leave mine at 1. And then you have your button size. This just makes your buttons larger or smaller. I will typically keep my buttons between about a 45 and a 60. A 60 is about as large as I go. Right now I'm running around a 50. I've been kind of running on the middle of the gamut there. So you can pick whatever size that you want to use. The next group of settings below are the bar settings. So the anchor point allows you to determine where you want your first button to be. So it can start bottom left and then move right and go up, or it can start on the bottom right, go left and up, top left to the right and down, and then so on and so forth. So I keep a top left. I would suggest keeping that as well. We're not going to mess with the alpha. We're not going to mess up with flyout directions. So the anchor point is really the only one we care about here. For strata and level, I really don't mess with these options at all. So if you want to play around with them, you certainly can. Looking at keybind text, this is one that I will look at. So the keybind text is what puts the little numbers or whatever your keybind is on top of for each of the buttons. So you have your positions, so you can move this anywhere you want. So you can go bottom left, you can go top. I personally like mine top right, so pick it wherever you'd like. And then if you don't like exactly where that position puts it, you can actually move the X and the Y axis if you want to move the buttons even further left or right or further up and down. So I normally just do top right and leave the X and Y offset where they are. You can also modify the font if you want. I normally don't, because if you pick a small enough text in the general settings, when we applied font to all, it should just inherit that same font. So I want to see the same font across all my action bars and all my UI. The count text is going to allow you to move where you see any cooldowns. So if I use a certain button that has a cooldown, you'll see that it puts a text counter on top of it. And as that gets shorter, it will actually give you how many seconds until that action comes off a cooldown. So again, you can just move the position around just like we did with the keybind text, and then you can modify the font if you wanted. So now that you have that understanding of those basic settings for your action bars, those same same settings can be applied to any of the other bars that you have. I'm not going to look at pet bar and stance bar. The pet bar would be used obviously if you have a pet. I don't typically use classes that have pets, so I disable that one. The stance bar is for your classes like druid or warrior, where you have different stances, or shapeshifting. Again, those are two classes I don't play very often, so I will typically disable that option. But if you enjoy that class, you can mess around with that bar. So the micro bar is basically their replacement for Blizzard's custom small bar that has some of those buttons that are in your keybinds. So your like your escape button, your character button, things like that. So what I will typically do with this is I will enable it, and then I will move it all the way to the bottom right of my screen. I don't typically mess with any of the button settings because I just want it small and kind of out of the way. And then I will click the mouse over option. And what that allows me to do is it allows it to hide on my screen. And if I ever need it for some reason, you know, say if I forget what one of my keybinds are for like collections, for instance, if I forget that it's Shift P, I can always just hover over here and figure out what it is. So again, you don't really need it, but something I like to have kind of hidden over in the corner. The last one we'll look at here is the extra buttons. So this one is actually pretty important. So this allows you to modify any boss buttons. It also allows you to modify any zone buttons and any vehicle exit buttons. Typically we see zone buttons in like for Shadowlands, we see zone buttons for like the Maw. Boss buttons you'll typically see in like raids. And then your vehicle button is obviously anytime you enter a vehicle, gives you that little button that you can click to jump out of it. So you'll notice the settings are exactly the same. So for the boss button, you can mess with the scale, you can mess with where the keybinds show, zone button, same thing. And then the vehicle button, you can mess with the size of the button itself. So go ahead and play around with those to make those buttons look the way you want. And then we're going to move into the next section, which is our buffs and debuffs. So the buffs and debuffs should be pretty short because there's really only one section of options that we mess around with, which is this first group of sections with how the buttons display. So you'll notice under the buffs tab, you have growth direction. So growth direction for me currently is set at left and then down. In my buttons, your buffs and debuffs, if you notice, if you toggle your anchor, should show up in the top right by default up by your mini map. So mine are currently growing to the left and then they're growing down. So you have different options. So you can go down and left, you can start up and left, right, and then go down. So whatever option you like visually. You can sort them if you want. So you can sort them by name, index, time. I just leave mine at time. And then you can sort what direction they're going. So mine are going left and down, so I'm having them going in a descending instead of going up in a ascending. You can separate your buffs. I just leave this as my auras first. You can really do whatever option. You can do others first, or you can just do no sorting, whatever option you want. I don't see that it has too big of an impact on anything. Then the size you have will modify your button size. I typically will make this probably a little smaller than my action bars unless my action bar buttons are pretty small. So again, around like a 40 to 50 is kind of what I use. Then you have a wrap after. What that states is that whatever number you put in the box, the next button after that number is going to then go into the next line based on what you have. So since I have a growth direction of left and down, my buttons are going to move left until it hits that wrap after. And then as soon as it hits that next numbered button after it, it's going to then go down a row and then start moving left again until it hits that wrap after, and then it's going to go down again and move all the way to left. So you can determine how far you want your buttons to move across the top of your screen before they hit a second row. The next option you'll see is the max wraps. So the max wraps is just identifying basically how many times I'm going to let a new line of buffs or debuffs show on my screen. So typically if you do 3 or 4 max wraps, I mean, unless you're in a large raid, you're still not typically going to see more than like 15, 20 buffs. So just make sure that you account for how many buffs you might see if you do raid, so that you're not accidentally not seeing buffs or debuffs that you want to be seeing. The horizontal and vertical spacing, the same as we saw with the action bars. This just allows you to define how much space you have between each of your buffs or each of your debuffs. The fade threshold I don't mess with. So what's nice about this is when you look at debuffs, all of the options are exactly the same. So I will typically start with buffs, get the settings the way I like them, and then just follow the same group of settings across my debuffs so that they look exactly the same. All right, now that we've gotten through that, we're going to move down to our last section here, which is maps. And this again is going to be a pretty quick one. So you have options to modify your world map and your mini map. Going into the general portion of this, you're going to see this smaller world map. This just allows you to to modify the scale of what your map looks like when you hit the M button. So I typically like to have mine kind of smallish. That way, when I hit M, it doesn't cover my entire screen, so I can still see something. For instance, if like I'm running away, but I'm being attacked and I want to see overall how far I am away from something. Whereas if you use a map that covers your entire screen and you start getting attacked, all it does is show like a red outline around the map, which is kind of hard to notice unless you're really looking for it. You'll notice though, with this option, it won't actually show you the size difference until you've exited out of Elvui and it's reloaded the add-on. The other option you'll see are world map coordinates. So this shows in the bottom left hand corner of your map, you will see, if you're mousing over the map, you'll see mouse coordinates and then you'll see player coordinates. I would suggest always enabling this because out in the world, people will announce coordinates of where world bosses are or where like chests or other items are. So it's good to have these on here so that you know how to find things easily. Again, you can move the position of where those coordinates show and then manually move them left or right or up and down with those X and Y offsets. Again, these changes won't actually display until you've closed out an Elvui configuration panel and then reloaded the UI. The other option you have here is the mini map, which controls obviously your mini map at the top right of your default UI. If you're not using a separate UI to manage this, like there's one out there called Sexy Maps that a lot of people like to use. If you're using Sexy Maps, then you would obviously turn this off because that add-on is going to control your mini map. If you're not using it, then you would turn it on, and we'll look at a couple options here. So the size and scale, just adjust the size of the mini map and then adjust the scale of the mini map and the various pins that you have. So like your map and calendar. I typically like my mini map pretty small because I find myself, I don't use the mini map as much as I do between toggling my smaller size map. We're going to skip over zoom. The text again is not super important to me. It should have taken on the text that you applied to all if you used a small enough text size. And then you'll see there are a couple mini map buttons towards the bottom that you might need to know where to find. So we don't care about garrison report because we don't use garrisons anymore. You have the LFG queue, which modifies that little green eyeball that shows up on your mini map whenever you queue for something. So this will just allow you to modify those sizes and where it shows on your mini map. You can look at your calendar. So again, if you wanted your calendar to show up, you can modify where it shows in the size of it. And then the last one I look at is my mail icon, which again allows me to modify those same settings. All the other ones here I don't mess with. All right, so that concludes kind of the basic settings that we have in here that will allow you to set up your UI the way you want it to look like. The last thing you can take a look at is actually toggling those anchors. So once you've gotten all your action bars, you'll want to toggle your anchors and you'll want to actually start moving the bars around. So you can simply do that by grabbing them and dragging them around the screen. Or if you want to get super meticulous with it, you can actually click on the bar and you can move it either by manually typing in on the X and Y offset, or you can move it around by clicking the left and right buttons and the up and down buttons. So that's really good if you are super into symmetry. You can modify that XY so that two elements match each other. I hope that this tutorial was useful in helping you to set up your Elvui interface and helps you get ready for Dragonflight. If you have any questions, feedback, or other content within Elvui that you'd like to see, please drop them in the comment section below. As always, I'd appreciate you liking the video and subscribing to help the channel grow. Until next time.